Hey, students, this is Professor Gore, and this is there's a lot that happens in the 1960s, and so these recorded lectures are going to be broken up into several more parts, just because there's so much content and so many concepts to cover, and so some clips will be longer than others, and so forth, and so just keep in mind there's going to be some more topics posted for this 1960s time period than other decades, just because there's a lot that happens in the 1960s. So the first thing I want to cover with this part is Kennedy's election and his domestic policy and so forth. So there is a lot that happened in the 1960s, as I mentioned. You have Vietnam War, which is going to consume a lot of the decade. You're also going to have Kennedy, who kind of represents this youthful vibrance that comes to the presidency. You also have the closest the United States and the Soviet Union have ever come to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, you also have the Beatles and the assassination of Kennedy. You also have Woodstock, the United States sending two individuals to land on the moon, the creation of the Peace Corps, also the tremendous aspect of the civil rights movement, both with the nonviolent protest side as well as the Black Power movement side of the civil rights movement. And so, with the election of 1960, it's actually one of the closest elections in American history. And Nixon, who had been the vice president under Eisenhower, um, came very, very close to winning this election. And really, it came down to Michigan, ended up being the swing state that gave Kennedy the election. And what's interesting is that television is going to play a role in this election because for the first time in American history, you're going to have a presidential debate on television. Now, candidates and so forth had sparred back and forth, and you might have it, Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated back in the election of 1860, 100 years before, but they did that in person. And so, what's interesting is that about this debate that ends up happening, those that listened to it on the radio, the majority of them said that Nixon won. Nixon knew policy, particularly foreign policy, better than Kennedy had, because Kennedy had been a one-term senator. Both had served in the United States Armed Forces. Kennedy was a veteran of World War II, and had actually had suffered from back problems due to his Adams disease, and so forth. But those that watch it on television overwhelmingly said Kennedy won. Nixon didn't sleep very well the night before, kind of came off as a little more cold. But Kennedy had something that you just can't teach, and that is charisma. And so he was able to, even though he didn't maybe know policy as well as Nixon, he came off better on national television. Lyndon B. Johnson is going to be Kennedy's VP. And actually, what's interesting is that the Kennedys and the Johnsons didn't really get along very well. And it was rumored that Johnson was selected as Kennedy's VP to get rid of him, and so forth. And the Kennedys kind of stiff-armed Johnson throughout somewhat during his presidency, and then LBJ is eventually going to become president. Kennedy was also the first Catholic president, and the United States had not seen a Catholic in the White House before, and so forth. Now, one of the things that helped Kennedy win the election was his family had a tremendous amount of wealth. His family had made money quite a bit in Massachusetts in the bootlegging industry during the Prohibition era, and they had funded a lot of his very expensive campaign. And really, thanks to his media advisors and his youthful, attractive personality, he was able to come off very well on television, more so than Nixon. Now, Nixon, who suffered defeat in this election, is going to make a comeback by winning the 1968 election later. And so what's interesting is that if you look at the overall popular vote, this is one of the closest elections in American history. Kennedy won 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.5. I mean, it doesn't get much closer than that. In terms of the popular vote in American history. There's only about 120,000 votes that separate the two candidates. And that is interesting, how close of an election it was in American history. And so this is a picture of the televised debate and so forth. You can see right here from this electoral college map how close it actually was in American history. Okay. Excuse me. All right. Now, a lot of historians kind of call the Kennedy presidency the Camelot years because Kennedy was the youngest president ever elected. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest president to ever serve in office. Teddy Roosevelt came into office in 1942 when McKinley was assassinated, but Kennedy was the youngest president ever elected. Now, Barack Obama was one of the youngest presidents. He was elected at 44, but that's just 1 year older than Kennedy, and so forth. And so I want to show you a picture in just a minute of JFK and his wife, Jackie Kennedy, going to the White House inauguration ball, which every president has, and so forth. And they look like a couple of movie stars. They were young, attractive, well dressed, stylish, and because of the baby boom generation, they kind of represent this youthful exuberance in American society. And Kennedy kind of, gone back. If you look back in American history, he is seen as kind of representing that, and so that's what kind of led to his popularity. Plus, he was assassinated, that kind of added to his overall popularity in history. Kennedy tried to appoint some of the best and brightest in his cabinet. For instance, he appointed Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense, who had made a very successful career in business. I think particularly over General Motors. You had C. Douglas Dillon as Secretary of the Treasury. And actually, because of his own family pressure, he appointed his brother Robert Kennedy as his Attorney General. So that's kind of interesting. His family did that. And he does serve in World War II. Now, the Democrats actually wanted him to run for the presidency in 1968 because of his Addison's disease that was affecting his back, that was kind of kept hidden from most of the United States. He decided to run in 1960 because he thought his time was short, health-wise, and he had suffered a lot of tremendous pain. When we get to his assassination, I'll explain why that back pain actually led to his death because of his back brace kept him upright in the car. So his domestic policy is called the New Frontier. It's not going to be very successful. He is going to get some stuff passed, such as Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress and so forth. But a lot of his democratic initiatives are going to actually be passed by LBJ and the Great Society. It's similar to Truman's Fair Deal, but it's actually LBJ is going to get a lot of that passed with the Great Society. One of the things Kennedy, his lasting legacy, is that he really pushed for the space race and putting a man on the moon, which he gets a lot of credit for that. Even though it happened during Nixon's presidency, Kennedy really gets a lot of credit for that actually happening. Also, the Berlin Wall is going to be built during his presidency. And then we'll get to the Cuban Missile Crisis in a later lecture. Also, U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So if you look at one of the things that Kennedy represents as youthful exuberance and so forth in the country is that 50% of the nation is under 25 in the U.S. Census in 1960. Also in 1960, the first contraception pill was invented. We call it birth control, and so forth. And so Kennedy, one thing that he's kind of forgotten about in American history, is actually a Cold War warrior. He had a very strong stance on the Cold War, that the United States had really pushed back hard against the Soviets, and we'll cover that in a later lecture as well. And so forth. It'll be kind of interesting to see how that plays out and so forth. Now, one thing that begins happening, started in the 1950s, but happened really in the 1960s. So for those that take world history too, we talk about decolonization. That's a really important topic in world history. But a lot of places began getting independence from these European powers in the 1960s. Now, there were some that got independence, like India in 1947. There's others that they get independence in the 1950s and so forth. But really, you see it happening, kind of set off a domino effect. A lot of countries, particularly in Africa, get their independence in the 1960s. And so you see these old European colonial powers collapsing and so forth. And that'll be an interesting development in world history that is certainly going to shape U.S. foreign policy, because all of this decolonization happens in the midst of the Cold War. And if it wasn't for the Cold War, it may not have taken the shape that it does in world history. And so you have the United States and the Soviet Union trying to entice these new independent countries to be democratic, if you're on the U.S. side, and maybe ally with the United States. But if you're on the Soviet side, you're trying to get them to convert, change their political climate to communism and create an alliance with the Soviet Union. So this push and pull and so forth of the Cold War shapes world history and so forth. And so I go much more in depth in this in my World History 2 class. So you can see right here the map and when the dates and all. Some of these countries don't get independence until the 70s or even the 80s, but you can see that a lot of them get their independence in the 1960s. Okay, now let's talk about Cuba, because Cuba had a communist revolution in the late 1950s, and they expelled their kind of democratic government and so forth. Now, when Castro, who actually could have been a professional baseball player, actually it's interesting that Cuba has very good baseball every year, and they do very well typically in the Olympics every 4 years in Summer Olympics. But Castro, when he staged his revolution, actually didn't come out and say he was going to be communist. After he seized power, then he implemented communism. A lot of middle class Cubans who the government tried to seize their property and their wealth, they fled Cuba, and a lot of them went to South Florida and leading into the Miami area, having a very large Cuban population. Eisenhower enacted a boycott, an embargo on Cuban goods. So that's why the United States hasn't traded with Cuba until recently, when the Obama administration changed that. And so that's why you see like Cuban cigars and so forth were illegal to purchase in the U.S. because of that embargo. And so the Eisenhower administration, the CIA had developed a plan to train Cuban citizens who had fled the United States to try to stage a revolution against Castro, so like a revolution against a revolution. And they had trained them with weapons and so forth. A lot of these were middle class Cubans. Some were doctors and lawyers and other business people and so forth. They weren't soldiers. And then the plan was they were going to land at the Bay of Pigs, okay, this Bay Area of Cuba, and then head to Havana. And because Castro was so unpopular at the time among the Cuban people because of his oppression, he actually imprisoned a greater percentage of his population for political suppression than even Stalin did. And when that's saying something. And so they thought that the countryside would support the overthrow of Castro. Well, what ends up happening is Eisenhower left the presidency. They didn't have time. The CIA didn't have time to implement the project. So within the first 6 months of Kennedy coming into office, he was presented with this opportunity and so forth. And so one of the things that ends up happening in his first year in office is that the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, announced that the Soviet Union intended to support wars of national liberation wherever in the world they occurred. So any kind of communist revolution. Kennedy wanted to keep Cuba out of Soviet influence, so he used the plan, this Bay of Pig invasion plan from Eisenhower. Now, Kennedy agreed to go ahead with it on one condition. Okay, he said that he would not agree to using U.S. air support to help this operation. Now, there's a problem because the CIA had told the Cuban nationalists that, hey, if this fails, you'll have U.S. air support. Okay, well, that didn't happen. So they get on to the Bay of Pigs, and most likely because of Soviet spying, they kind of knew that they were coming, and they get pinned down on the beachhead. And Kennedy decided not to go with the airstrike, and so all of these Cuban nationalists are captured and imprisoned. What ends up happening, it's a public relations nightmare for the international world, and Kennedy has to publicly apologize when this 14-man force was captured or killed by Cuban soldiers. And anyway, it kind of started his presidency off on a bad start. And what's going to happen is Castro now is going to go into the arms of the Soviets. In fact, when they met at the UN, they were constantly kind of looked like they had a bromance going on and hugging each other with Castro and Khrushchev and so forth. And you're going to create an alliance with the Soviet Union. And remember that Cuba is just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. So that's an ally very close to the back door of the United States. And so that's going to be a conflict that's going to reemerge when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, two things that Kennedy established that he is known for is the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Alliance for Progress or Alliance for Peace, depending on what you call it. And so one of the things what the Peace Corps did, is still around today, is try to establish better relations to help third world countries. Now, really, it was kind of birthed out of J. William Fulbright, who's a famous Democratic senator from Arkansas, who said, countries would get along a whole lot better if they got to know one another. And so what the Peace Corps does is it recruits college graduates to go give up 2 years of their life and go work in third world countries on different things. I'll give you an example. When I went to Guatemala one time, I met a Peace Corps worker who graduated from the University of Arizona who was working on tourism in Guatemala. Guatemala has Central America's largest waterfall, which I've actually seen. And he works on tourism advertising to get people to travel from different parts of the world to see this beautiful waterfall, to help provide revenue and so forth from tourism. And so that's an example of what the Peace Corps actually does. The State Department's Agency for International Development coordinated foreign aid for the Third World, and its Food for Peace program distributed surplus agricultural products around the world. In 1961, the president proposed a 10-year plan for the Americas called the Alliance for Progress, sometimes called Alliance for Peace, a $20 billion partnership between the United States and the republics of Latin America to reverse the cycle of poverty and stimulate economic growth. Kennedy was also keen on space exploration. Kennedy proposed that the nation commit itself to landing a man on the moon within the decade. 2 weeks later, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space for the United States. Now, there was actually a Soviet Soviet cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin who did it before Alan Shepard. And if you ever read the book The Right Stuff, or seen the movie The Right Stuff, it portrays that. So here's some statistics on the Alliance for Progress success. You can see how much more school age enrollment increases because of the money spent for the Alliance for Peace. Okay. Now, also later, I forgot to mention Kennedy. They also sent up John Glenn, who ends up becoming a congressman later. He's a very famous American at the time, and really the astronauts are some of the biggest celebrities in the country in the 1960s. Now, Kennedy's domestic plan, they embraced Keynesian economics by believing in deficit spending to stimulate economic growth. Now, John Maynard Keynes would have favored deficit spending during the Great Depression and World War II, but probably not in the 1960s. Kennedy also, along with LBJ, reduced income taxes. Now, that was very popular. Anytime you have less taxes, typically, a lot of Americans are like, yeah, I have more of a bigger paycheck. And so the 1960s economy is great. The problem is, what you're going to see long term as we get to the 1970s, is that you can't cut income taxes and then have a very expensive program called the Great Society and a very expensive war being the Vietnam War and try to pay for them at the same time. And that's what's going to lead to the federal government end up borrowing from Social Security, which also puts Social Security at risk in present day. So that's going to have long-term consequences. Okay. So this tax cut, they argued, would put money in the hands of consumers, which it does, thereby generating more demand, more jobs, and ultimately higher tax revenues. It finally passed in Congress in 1964, the year after Kennedy was assassinated. Kennedy managed to push through legislation raising the minimum wage and expanding Social Security. But on other emerging issues like federal aid to education, mass transportation, and medical insurance for the elderly, which is what we call Medicaid, he had a really resistance in Congress by conservatives at the time. But you'll see that LBJ is going to get that stuff passed with the Great Society. He did improve surplus food to unemployed Americans. Okay. He does, at that time, the largest defense buildup in peacetime history up to this point in American history. We'll see that's going to change when we get to Reagan. He did try to push for all these different things. So, for instance, he did expand the national park system, which I'm personally a fan of. I love our national parks. He also tried to double federal resources combating water pollution. And we did create the first world's largest nuclear power plant. Okay. Also trying to tightening food and drug laws and so forth, and it did encourage free trade. Eventually, though, him and Khrushchev did sign a nuclear test ban treaty, which is good. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were working on that deal until the U-2 spy plane incident happened. All right, now the space program is really, like I mentioned, is what Kennedy is probably most known for and gets a lot of credit for in U.S. history. Because he really pushes for funding of NASA. And even though the United States doesn't land on the moon until 1969, it's the foundation of this that actually leads to it ended up happening in 1969. In fact, Kennedy, the reason why he was in Dallas, he had flown to San Antonio to give a speech for NASA and the space race, and then had stopped back into Dallas to help the governor of Texas campaign for his election in 1963. And that's why they were riding in the car together in the convertible that ended up getting him assassinated. This is John Glenn, standing right outside Friendship 7, where he went into outer space. First astronaut to orbit the Earth's surface 3 times, but he was certainly not the first person in outer space. Now, Kennedy also came up with a new military policy. It's called flexible response. I like to call it common sense. And so instead of threaten nuclear war all the time, you basically he created actually the Special Forces, which is the Green Berets. Sometimes you just send in the Green Berets to handle an issue. Sometimes you send in the 101st Airborne Division. Sometimes you use diplomacy. It's basically like we're not going to have kind of a one size fits all strategy. We're going to use flexible response depending on the situation. So in Vietnam, it may be sending in some military advisors and weapons, rather than sending in massive amounts of American troops, which is going to happen starting in 1965. Okay. Also, he does push for the tripling of nuclear capabilities of the U.S. By using different types of nuclear weapons and the different abilities. This is all part of the arms race during the Cold War. The Soviet Union is going to develop similar stuff as well. And we'll get to the civil rights movement in the next part.